Hello, everyone. My name is Sabian Edouard. I'm a college student at Middlebury, and I have the pleasure today of introducing our guest speaker, David Bain. Today we're going to be speaking about the project that the opera company at Middlebury has done regarding the Transcontinental Railroad and history, right? Who is left in and who is spoken about. So the first question I want to pose to you, David Bain, is how and why did the Chinese arrive to America? Were they fleeing prosecution like many other immigrants, or were they promised lives full of riches and work by American, American company owners and such?
Well, most of the California Chinese came from Guangdong province in southern China, a place that had been racked with famine, with banditry, with a careless imperial government, and then finally with a civil war. And in 1850, the word of the California gold rush came to China, and then just hundreds and then thousands of Chinese began to borrow the money to take the ship across to California and make their life.
Thinking about, this mass exodus of people, as you spoke about, from Guangdong, which is actually where my family is from.
Really?
Yeah, my Chinese ancestry. So it's really interesting to sort of imagine just how that journey must have been.
Absolutely.
I'm sure it's a very hard journey for any immigrant family to leave your home, to come into this mysterious place where you're not really welcome, which is something we could talk about. So what could you imagine the feeling or would be like for these Chinese immigrants who came to America, who were possibly subdued by some laws that were passed against them? What did that situation sort of look like?
Well, you can imagine perhaps drawing some kind of comfort in the steerage, lowest part of the boat, going across for 2 months to California. That at least having hundreds of other Chinese with you would be reassuring, and getting to the wharf in San Francisco, being met by a Chinese mutual aid company that was going to usher you up into Chinatown and into California would be there. But unfortunately, with racism, with being away from population centers, there was certainly a lot of trouble that the Chinese endured.
And do you believe that there was a concerted effort to sort of, take away these resources from the Chinese people or make them feel like they were othered?
Well, initially at first, China had sent so many of its young men over. In California, it was much less populated than it is now, and less of a presence of law. Ramshackle wooden towns everywhere that you went. No real highways, just muddy traces up into the hills. And it was just basically a place where almost anything went at that point, and so that there weren't a whole lot of safeguards for these newly arrived immigrants who were just seeking their fortune.
So how were the Chinese laborers? How was their labor contracted, and how were they brought into America to start working on this project?
Well, a lot of Chinese were already in California. Thousands, we don't know how many. Thousands remained in California, taking local jobs, perhaps opening restaurants or laundries, doing basically the low rung of the ladder kinds of things.
Was that initially from the gold rush era?
Yeah, from the gold rush era. And when the Transcontinental Railroad project began, they finally got to the point where they had enough money to hire a large workforce for the year. They advertised for 5,000 men, 200 showed up. And someone said, well, why don't we hire some Chinese, because there seemed to be a lot around California. And the labor boss, whose name was James Harvey Strobridge, said, no, they're too small, they're too thin, they're not strong, they'd never last in this kind of thing. And he and his boss, Charlie Crocker, were out on the railroad route as it was beginning in the lowlands. And some of the white Irish workers began a strike. And so Charlie Crocker said in a loud voice, "Why don't you send down to Auburn and hire some Chinese to take these guys' places?" The strike ended immediately, but they got the idea. They got the idea that this might be something to try. So they hired 50. They worked out like magic. They hired another 50. They hired another 50. And by April of that year, 4 months later, there were 4,000 on the job. The vice president, Charles Crocker, boasted to all of his friends and to his partners out in the East Coast that the Chinese were absolutely wonderful workers. They didn't complain. They did great things, not only just digging into the mountainside, but working with explosives, et cetera, et cetera. This was all in like 2 months. They proved themselves, and they had thousands at work already.
How were they seen compared to like Irish workers and other white workers?
Well, the Irish workers were a little fearful because, in fact, one of them once said to Crocker that if these damn Chinese weren't here, we'd be getting this much more money and we'd have to work only half as hard. So there was a certain amount of competition going on, but the Chinese were doing such an amazing job in California that they just kept going and going. 2,000 to 4,000 to 6,000 by the end of the first year, 6,000, 8,000 the second year, all the way up to 12,000 at one time.
So was that increase because they were just doing such a great job on the railroad?
Yes, they were doing an amazing job. They could do just about anything. They could do anything that was handed to them. And the higher up they got in the mountains, the more work that had to be done. They had to move the mountainside out of the way. They had to dig 12 tunnels. Some of them were 1,000 feet long. Some of them were a half a mile long.
And after they did all this work, were they granted citizenship?
No.
No.
No, that was a long time in coming. It was a long time in coming. There'd been a history since they began to arrive in numbers in California. There was the Page Act in 1855. There was one act after another that were passed by local towns, municipalities, counties, then finally the state of California, and then finally from Washington, D.C. came the edict, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was long after the railroad was done. That was in 1882, but there were all sorts of measures that were passed. For instance, Chinese and blacks and Native Americans could not testify against a white man in court.
So even after all of their hard labor and their work, they were still, I mean, we see from like social stigma such as the yellow peril, that Chinese, among other people of color, were certainly stigmatized against.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's funny because we see that, just in history and who tells it, we see that it's formulated in a way that it includes much history against marginalized groups in America. However, it doesn't really include a lot of their contributions and their sacrifices.
Absolutely. The Exclusion Act was 1882. No Chinese allowed into the United States as immigrants. And finally in 1943, so that was a good 60 years later, they let in about 150 each year. And then finally in the 1950s, any kind of exclusion on racial or national backgrounds was dropped. But that is an awfully long time to be nativist, to be afraid of the other, quote unquote.
I agree.
Yeah, not a respectable history, our country, and that's unfortunately true for many.
Certainly not, but I think this project definitely is showing some light on some significant contributions that people of color had made in our history. which actually brings us to this picture behind us.
Yeah.
Could you sort of tell our viewers a little bit about this photo?
Well, this is May 10th, 1869. This was at the gathering of, or the bringing together of the Central Pacific on the left and the Union Pacific, which had come across all the way from the Missouri River at Omaha. And after just extraordinary toil, tens of thousands of laborers, they finally met in the desert of northern Utah. And there weren't a whole lot of people there.
Yeah, I see actually a lot of people here, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of workers, at least the ones that we've been talking about the past couple minutes.
The Chinese workers were paid great homage in the speeches. They were part of the ceremony. A work gang of Chinese brought up the last rail, the last spike, et cetera, et cetera. They pounded it in, 3 cheers, et cetera, and then they seem to have been moved to the edge of things. And for decades, historians have looked at this picture of the shaking of the 2 chief engineers' hands, a toasting of champagne up there, men raising their hats for the photographer, et cetera, and could not find any Chinese in here. And we saw this as being elemental, emblematic of the exclusion spirit that was rife in America at this point. But just recently, we historians have been looking at this, and we have actually found some surprises. Now you think about this. There's a man back here with his camera. People are cheering. They're trying to hold still for several seconds so they won't be a blur. And if you look here, you can see a man's hat, and you can see a form of a rather short person. You see another rather short person standing here who has a hat pulled down over his head, and he's facing away. And now we know from the clothing and from just intuition that these were 2 Chinese men who were probably honored just before with the laying of the last rail, and they turned up for the picture. Someone put his hat, joke, put his hat in front of one, and someone else turned this man around really fast. And thus, for at least a part of our history, erasing, literally erasing people from the triumphant moment after all of the work that they did, which is heartbreaking.
It is. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure. I'll tell you one thing. Every year at Promontory, which is a national monument, they have reenactments on May 10th. And now Chinese Americans have been showing up by the scores and having their picture taken in front of the 2 replica engines, which look just like this. And by that way, paying respect to their ancestors and to their people, and trying to right that historical wrong from 1869.
I'm glad that we were able to be a part of that process as well.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing everything. Thank you for this
you.
interview.